Good afternoon. Okay, I guess we should start. Well, obviously, today we will talk about Thomas Aquinas, but before we do that, we should talk a little bit about the exam, because it was the first one, and it always makes it a little more clear how class is going to proceed after the first exam. So first of all, the results. This is the results for your guys' section. Other sections which are fully online have very similar results, so if they watch it later, it applies to them more or less too. But this is statistics for your specific class, and your average score was 84%. That is pretty good, solid average. It's actually excellent average. I must say, in classroom, when students do not have any notes, the typical average is around 70%. So that obviously is very good. By the way, right away I want to warn you, because from my experience in this class, students do worse on a second exam than they did on the first one. And the reason, I think, is because they relax. They're thinking, oh, it's so easy, I can do it, no problem. And then when it comes to the second exam, turns out actually that's not as easy as they may have thought. The highest is 100%, so somebody did all of them. That also clearly shows to you guys that, it's entirely doable, since one of the students who is just like you was able to answer all the questions. Then clearly all the questions can be answered, at least theoretically. The lowest was 67%. That, of course, is not very good, because, well, again, given the average, given that some people scored 100, if you are scoring, my cat is, my cat is wandering around. Yeah, so if you are getting 67, something clearly wasn't working. Yeah, sometimes he would like to help. Say hello. You want to say hello? He wants to say hello. Anyway, average time 28.45 minutes. So less than 29 minutes. Again, as you can see, 45 minutes was like really generous. This is average, so some people did it faster than that. Some people took longer, but 45 minutes should be plenty to everybody. Now this is the grade distribution, so note that this is like how many people, 1, 2, 3, 4 people in each percentage. Let me make it a little bit bigger. So hopefully you can see here that this is the one person who got 100, somebody got like 90 something, 98 or whatever, 4 people got like about 92 or 93, and so on. Majority is here between 85 and 100, and then there are some students, like one student in this range, getting something between 67 and looks like 85. So again, that is a pretty strong result. Now, another thing you may be interested in, what questions didn't students get? I don't know if you can see the statistics. I can see the statistics, how many students got which question wrong, and after looking at it, I see after looking at them, this is the 2 questions which a lot of students got wrong. So let me just go back to them, because also remember, final will be cumulative. What I do on the final is about half of the questions comes from the first 2 exams. So some of the same questions will be there. It makes it much easier for you if you will prepare the first time, because you have your notes, right? You just pull those notes, you already have all these answers. It makes it harder for you if you didn't prepare the first time, because then you have to do the entire work. But that also means that you should still care about these questions. Okay, so this is the 2. The cynic emphasized the opposition of what? The correct answer was nature and convention. Only 45%, less than half of students got it right. Remember, physis and nomos, the nature and convention. That's what they emphasized. This question did even worse, and I can kind of see why, because it's a little bit weirdly phrased. The Pyrrhonian skeptics criticized the academic skeptics because the latter did what? And the correct answer here is claimed that even though we do not have the certainty, we can have beliefs that are probable. Most students on this question, only 26% got it right, chose belief that nothing is self-evident and nothing can be proven. No doubt that this says Pyrrhonian skeptics criticized academic skeptics because the latter, meaning that they criticized them for their view, for the view of the academic skeptics. Pyrrhonian skeptics were a lot more skeptical than academic. They couldn't possibly criticize them because they believed that nothing is self-evident. They criticized them because they thought they were not critical enough. And we did cover it at the very end of last lecture. I actually looked at the video. I was mentioning that the Pyrrhonians, according to the Pyrrhonians, we cannot have beliefs at all. Even any kind of belief you have, they thought, including the belief that you can't know anything, the way Socrates was saying, is too much. Because how do you know you can't know anything? So that's why they criticized the academics. They thought they were not skeptical enough. They claimed that we can have some sort of certainty somewhere, at least in probabilities. So that's this question. But again, somebody did answer it correctly, so I think it was answerable, if not easy. But since results are so good, you really have nothing to worry about. As long as you continue like that, majority of students would get an A in this class without any problem. And before, I also had an essay, but I removed it, partly because some students complained that it was too difficult, and I realized it being online, it may indeed be complicated for students to do an essay. Also, another problem with that is most of you guys come straight from high school. You don't have English 101 yet. Didn't take English 101. And you really should take English 101 before you write any kind of essay for other classes, because it really looks to me like the high school type preparation isn't good enough. And for this reason, I removed the essay completely. There's no essay. There's just the 3 exams and the homework and extra credit on top of that. So for a student who puts at least a decent amount of effort, that should be an easy A. But of course, some students still manage to fail it somehow. And there's nothing I can do about that, because if you're not doing the work, what can I do? Okay. What do you mean you didn't catch the last phrase? Which last phrase? Last in relation to what? Yeah, well, but that wasn't the question. This is exactly how the question was. Pyrrhonian skeptics criticized the academic skeptics because the latter. And I do realize that if you skip this letter, that kind of is important part of the thing, but you have to read them carefully. There's plenty of time, right? There's no need to rush. Just read them well. Now that's okay. If you go in and out, that's fine. I mean, I understand sometimes internet doesn't work very well. You can also watch it later if you want, because I'll upload it as usual, so no problem. Okay, so now let's get to the material at hand, which is very interesting. We only spent 1 class on medieval philosophy, but it's an extremely interesting subject. Why do we only spend 1 class? Well, because, this class is limited. It's an introductory class. If we spend more time on medieval, we'll have to kick out some of the other important stuff, and you will see that there is a lot of other cool stuff we'll cover after that. So 1 class is a minimum. But Hopefully you watched the video. Only about 28 people watched the video. Hopefully you did, because I was talking about it there too, but I want to repeat it. We start with the birth of Christianity. Jesus of Nazareth. Why? Well, hopefully you'll understand why. It had enormous effect. Clearly, we still are affected by this event, by Jesus, by his birth, by his crucifixion, by his life, by his teachings. So that naturally changed a lot of things for philosophy too. Now, what do we know about Jesus? Well, most of what we know from the canonical Gospels, from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And there's heated debate among scholars regarding which order they were written in, what years it happened. So it's really difficult to actually even go there in a strictly scientific type of way. But I guess for most people who consider themselves Christians, it doesn't really matter what order they were exactly written, but the substance of Christian religion comes from these Gospels, because they tell us in detail what did Jesus preach. Other than that, we have some other sources which mention Jesus, but they don't go into too many details, so this is the main source. How historically reliable it is? Well, obviously, if you take a point of view of, strictly scientific point of view, it's difficult to be sure that everything is reliable, given that it doesn't have corroborating evidence. In the same time, naturally, for people who are Christians, that's not exactly a question, because this is a holy book. It's something which is taken as authority and is not questioned. Okay, now there is more or less a consensus among scholars that Jesus did indeed exist, and that happened when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, where the whole event took place between the years 26 and 36. And during this time, Pontius Pilate has authorized the crucifixion of Jesus. Now, after his death, as you, again, guys probably know, his followers said that he arose from the dead, and that kind of starts our story. Now, the early Christians were heavily persecuted. Rome, if you remember, again, a little bit of history, Rome, just like Greece, were pagan. They believed in multiple gods, and they naturally were not very inclined to believe in Jesus. So early Christians, for one thing, had to deal with persecution. The other problem they had is actually at the beginning it was considered rather obvious that Jesus will come back very soon. They thought Jesus will be back during their lifetime, and then this judgment day will come. Naturally, as time passed, it became obvious that that probably is not going to be very soon. It's going to take much longer. The book kind of talks about it too. Then they started working out some sort of coherent story about Christianity in general, about the teachings of Jesus, which again had to compete with those Greek philosophies we have talked about before the exam. In particular, the Stoics were still around, Epicureans were still around. Another philosophy which took kind of root at the time, Neoplatonism, was very heavily based on Plato, on the teachings of Plato. So remember his teachings, the good, the source of all goodness, which again can be compared to God, but it's not really God. He never calls it God. Plato himself never says that it is God. He says the good, which is the source, the form of the good, and the source of all goodness. So all these philosophers were around, and people who considered themselves followers of Christ also started working on kind of merging the whole thing and trying to not just read the New Testament, but coming up with a more comprehensive explanation. That led to different variations as to what exactly is the correct way to believe in Christ. And that is known as heresies. Heresy in Greek actually means choice. So it's not as bad as the connotation this word has today. When you say heresy, it's like, oh, it's something bad. Back then they didn't think of it as anything bad. They just thought of it as variety of choices. How do you believe in Christ? Gnosticism was one of the options. It was quite popular, and it actually is based on Christianity too. It's based on the New Testament and teachings of Christ, but with quite a bit of variation. And Manichaeanism, which St. Augustine was preaching before he became Christian, was also a very popular variety, kind of very similar to Gnosticism. You may even say it is offshoot of Gnosticism. They believed that there were two gods, one good God and one bad God. Jesus was sent by the good God to save us and to oppose the bad God. You may say, well, isn't it the devil? Well, not quite, because they thought that the bad God is actually as powerful as the good one. So there's a constant battle going on. But you can see that obviously there are similarities with regular Christianity. However, this is an important point. We're not going to go through all of their teachings because that will lead us too far astray. But the idea was these two gods, they are fighting. Jesus came to help out human beings to choose the correct way towards the correct God, the God of light. Okay, now just briefly looking at some of these questions again, which will be on some of them will be on the next exam, and basing it on the video, which you guys hopefully see. Let's look at what would be the correct answers here, and let's see who can get extra credit for that too. So, what was the problem of faith and reason for early Christian thinkers? Can you answer it more or less in one sentence? What exactly was the problem of faith and reason? Well, we can even ask ourselves, well, fine, we'll do it as a discussion later, but this reason wasn't present for the Greeks. Why wasn't it present for the Greeks? The Greeks actually didn't have any kind of testament. New Testament, Old Testament, or whatever other testament. They did believe in those multiple gods, but note that it did not bother them and did not prevent them from using their reasoning. So they only believed in reason. Interestingly enough, it also wasn't present for the Jews, because note that the Jews had their Old Testament, which they just called Testament, the Holy Book, the Bible, for thousands of years already by this time. And they believed it completely. They never questioned that. Now, for the Christians at that point, naturally, there was a problem between, do you actually read the New Testament and take it for granted and just say, well, if it says so, then that's how things are, or do you actually use your reason and ask yourself, well, how is it realistic? How realistic is it, for example, to walk on water, right? So that became a problem, and the correct answer would be whether or not one could find truth through both Christian faith and through philosophical reason. How do you find the truth? Because people want to find the truth, but can you combine it? Can you use Testament as the way to truth and still use your reason? Now, what philosopher had the most influence on Augustine? Again, that would be in the video. Plato. Okay, good job. Yes, Plato. Well, to be precise, just to clarify it a little bit, Louis gets the extra credit. He never read Plato. He read Neoplatonist philosophers. But since they were basing it on the teachings of Plato, that kind of essentially how we can say that Plato had the most influence, because Plato wrote all this stuff. He influenced Neoplatonist philosophers, Porphyry, among others, Plotinus, Porphyry. So when St. Augustine read that, he actually thought that it made sense, and he tried to introduce it into this Christian religion, because he thought that it is compatible with that. And you can see why it's compatible, right? The philosopher going out of the cave towards the goodness, the source of all goodness, all that stuff naturally seem like, many of you guys already said, well, it sounds like God. Yeah, that's why. Because even though for Plato it wasn't God, it was the source of goodness and light, which he never called God. But Augustine said, well, that sounds like God to me too. So perhaps Plato meant God, even though he never said God. Okay, how does Augustine describe God's relation to time? Again, that would be in the video. Yes, exactly. God is outside of time. So this is something he specifically picks up on, and it would be quite influential later too. So this is what he said. God is not in time. It's not like he's sitting there watching us as if we are on a television set. God created time. There was really no like a day before the creation of the world, and there won't be any day after the world destroyed or something. It's all for God happens simultaneously, because he's simply outside of time. Okay, good job, Pinium. Extra credit for you. Okay. How does Augustine argue regarding, what does Augustine argue regarding the relations between human freedom and God's knowledge of the future? Well, it sounds like a question, right? But that's the question. That is the question which was raised. What does Augustine say? I mean, obviously he gives an answer to that. Again, it's actually also in the book. Yes, again, that's correct. Humans have free will, and God also is the cause of everything. He thinks it's perfectly compatible. Again, good job, Pinium. He thinks that there's no contradiction here, because God is outside time, right? God is kind of observing everything simultaneously, but that does not preclude us from having free will. So even though God knows what you will choose for breakfast tomorrow, and you don't know that yet, and you theoretically have a choice, so you can choose whatever you want, that does not mean that just God knowing about you, say, choosing burrito for breakfast tomorrow, you don't have any choice there, because you have a choice. It's just like God simultaneously knows everything that will happen and what choice you will make. Okay, what two cities does Augustine discuss in his philosophy of history? Well, Rome is one of them, but what's the other one? By the way, multiple choice may have Rome and one other city which is not the correct one, so that's not going to help you very much to answer this question on the exam. What is the whole point though of what he's saying? Again, I did kind of address it in the video. And the book talks about it too. So Rome was sacked at the time. It was sacked for the first time during the life of Augustine. It did not completely fall. It will actually fall to the barbarians later, but it was sacked. And it was a very shocking event for them. And many of the barbarians, remember, Christianity, it was already official religion. It became official religion of Rome in the year 312. Constantine was the first Roman emperor who accepted Christianity and decided that Roman Empire will be Christian. Nonetheless, many, especially nobility, were still pagan. They did not convert. and they felt like this was their tradition, their traditional religion. So many people after the fall of Rome started saying, and it seems kind of natural, isn't it? They were saying, look at that, we accepted Christianity and barbarians come and all sorts of other trouble. So maybe Christianity is to blame. Maybe when we were pagan, our pagan gods were protecting us. Zeus and all these other ones. But with Christianity now, that is no longer the case. Although they didn't call Zeus, that's actually Greek name for Zeus, but nonetheless, same God, different name. So the whole point of the book by Augustine is to tell people, no, that is not the case at all. Actually, Rome has been punished. And it has been punished not because it became Christian, but because it didn't become Christian enough. Because it is still essentially a pagan city with all these pagan entertainments, such as, gladiator fights and all that stuff you probably know from Hollywood movies. So while theoretically it became Christian, but it's not really living up to the Christian ideal. And for that, Rome is punished. So he talks about the city of God, and he talks about the city of the world. And he's saying you should be on the side of God and not of the side of the worldly city. Aber the Catholics, for a long time, the only Christian church was a Catholic church. It's only later that the division happened. And in fact, there were a couple of divisions. One of them is when Orthodox, eastern part of the Roman Empire broke off from the western part. And that was the first split, but it happened quite a bit later. And then after that, the most famous Protestant Reformation, which we'll talk about next week, happened, at which point there became Protestant religion. People who are Christians, but they were saying, we are Protestant, we are not Catholics. Prior to that, there was simply no difference. The only Christian church was the Catholic Church, and, they had no other options but being Catholics. So Roman Catholics, that's essentially how we today call the denomination, the religious denomination, which still follows the Pope of Rome. And note that many Protestants do not accept the Pope of Rome. And when you talk about Roman Christians, you basically just say people who lived 1700 years ago and who were Christians. Note that at some point they didn't have a pope, then they had a pope, and so on. But that is the difference. Okay, so yes, the distinction is the city of the world and the city of God. That's not between Rome and Jerusalem, it's not between Rome and whatever other city, it is between the city of God and the city of the world. Okay, I hope we're not going to run out of time because there's still a lot to talk about. But so Middle Ages, this is what we're going to be dealing with. The term Middle Ages refers to roughly 1,000 year period. It starts from the fall of Rome. It actually properly starts when Rome fell to the barbarians. Odoacer, the chieftain from the north, became the emperor of Rome. One of those barbarians who lived more or less where Germany is today, I think they were kind of coming south, and they were strong enough to completely capture Rome. Although note that they actually still had most of their power structure preserved. They still had their, what do they call it, Senate, where the senators were deciding the important issues. It's just that Odoacer had a power of veto. He essentially became kind of like the president of sorts, of the king who could do whatever he wanted. And even though Rome itself still existed, Odoacer had the final word in terms of like what will be happening. It happened 476, that's already like what, almost 40 years after Augustine actually died. So they sacked it several times, and then finally they completely captured it. And from that period until roughly 1500, until Reformation, which we'll talk about next week, that is the medieval period. It obviously is a very large chunk of time. There's a lot of stuff going on there. We'll just go over a few most important ones. So first of all, Constantinople, and like I said, the Roman Empire it is so huge. At one point they decided to have a second center just so that they could control it. Constantinople, which by the way today that's actually Turkey, that's Istanbul, became second center of the empire. But then it grew so powerful that the empire split into two halves. One half was Roman, and with the center in Rome. The other half, which later gave the beginning to the Orthodox Christianity, is in Constantinople. And then eventually Constantinople also fell to the Turks. They captured it, and so on. But we're not going to go too far into history. This is more or less what was happening between years 400 and 1000. We kind of call it more or less dark years because we don't even know very much and there wasn't that much going on. So in this class we will pretty much skip it completely, jump straight from, 430 when Augustine died to the years after 1000. Just another thing to mention, church was very powerful during this time. Church became one institution which really could hold control. Monarchs, all sorts of civil leaders, they just could not exercise control over the people without the help of church. And the Pope was more or less endorsing the kings. If the Pope would excommunicate the king, one of the French kings, by the way, had to do penance and actually stand on his knees and beg the Pope to remove the excommunication, because, if the Pope excommunicates the king is no longer seen as having any authority. And that is naturally a big problem for the king. So even kings had to listen to the Pope. The Pope was more or less the head of the world at that time, at least the head of the Western world. Okay, now another interesting thing is how the first universities began. Just a few words about that, because they started from around year 800 when Charlemagne, who was emperor of what is now France, this part of Europe, started to restoring some of the schools, monastic schools. And that kind of gave it the start, the cathedral schools where they were praying. But later, they started growing into what today we call a university. By the 13th century, there were already a number of universities in Europe, actually teaching in a way similar to the way we do it today. Well, not today, because today we do it online, but the way we do it in school buildings. Right? So in the 13th century in Europe, there were already several. One of the most well-known universities was University of Paris. There is also University of Bologna, Naples, Montpellier, Oxford, and Cambridge. All of them were functional in the 13th century. It's kind of hard to say when exactly each one of them appeared, because they did not have a day. Like today we can say, okay, in 1953 or whatever, we inaugurated the University of, I don't know, Nevada, Las Vegas. It's probably not the right date, but for example, right? At the time they didn't do it. It was more like, for a while, students would gather in one place to listen to one master. Then maybe a few more masters will come because they enjoyed the fact that they can share students. Students would pay masters directly to be taught, but then there will be so many masters and so many students in one place that they will kind of start to organize themselves into something bigger. And that's how first universities began. Now, this period is also Rise of Scholasticism. The book mentions Scholasticism. That's very important to understand, especially when you talk about Thomas Aquinas, because he was doing exactly what scholastics were doing. what were scholastics doing? They were trying to work out the way to combine the Bible with philosophy. That's more or less their project, integration of faith and reason. Religious belief, how is it working with reason? And one of the reasons they were actually doing it at the time is teachings of Aristotle. Teachings of Aristotle, most of them were lost for a very long time. Why? Well, it's written in Greek, right? Greek language was kind of slowly drifting away in Europe. Even Augustine, around year 400, he already did not speak Greek. What language did they speak? Latin. Latin was the language of the Roman Empire. But not all works by Aristotle and Plato were translated into Latin. What was translated into Latin? Bible. Bible from the very beginning was in Latin, even though it's not written in Latin. The Old Testament is written in Hebrew and the New Testament in Greek, but the whole thing was translated into Latin language, and so most people who lived at the time knew Latin, but they did not know ancient Greek. And slowly, because they had to, all these books were not printed, right? They were handwritten copies. Slowly, more and more of the works of Aristotle and Plato were lost. But what happened during the 13th century is some of these books came back. And so the project which scholastics were dealing with in those universities was to try to combine sacred scriptures, the Old and New Testament, the writings of the church fathers, including Augustine, who was, by the way, considered at that time already a church father and authority of the church, and works of Aristotle. We're not really talking about Boethius that much, but he was another figure important for them. So they were kind of literally combining them and trying to figure out what was going on. And by the way, this is, I guess, good time for this discussion. So the problem of faith and reason. Now, what do you think was the problem? Can you come up with some other questions which indeed somebody might ask? Let's say if you read the Bible, if you read the New Testament, for example, what could be problematic? Any examples? Some of them are just like on the surface, right? We're not just challenging God. New Testament. Did any of you guys read the New Testament? What's the most important event in terms of Christ? Resurrection. Yeah, he rose from the dead. Now, what does your reason tell you? How often do you see people coming back from the dead? Did anybody see that? I mean, you don't really need scientific knowledge in order to, have problem with that, right? And back then it was just as problematic as it is today. Probably a little less, because today we also have the physiology and all that stuff. But even back then people were obviously questioning that and saying, well, how is that reasonable? We've never seen anybody rise from the dead. The Christians say he rose from the dead. If you're familiar with this story, there's several other things. I already mentioned walking on water. Remember, they also fed 10,000 people or something with 2 breads. All of this stuff does seem to defy reason. If you're using your reason and logic, that seems problematic. So how do you actually put it together? Should you just forget your reason and logic? Should you say, well, reason is one thing, but the belief is another thing? But then what could be the problem? Well, yeah, there's lots of stuff. Old Testament and New Testament both. Lots of stuff there, like if you're using your reasoning and logic, doesn't make much sense. We will deal with it quite a bit more, and you will see what answers philosophers were providing. Because also note that in medieval period, it was kind of dangerous subject to begin with. People who are asking this kind of question sometimes could be censured by the church. The church was not very happy when people would start questioning that. So even though in those universities they were trying to combine faith and reason, but what they were literally doing is, of course, try to take the Old and New Testament as unquestionable truth and then somehow explain all these things, but explain them using reason. Well, that's a great question. How can you logically explain the supernatural when faith simply says God can make it possible? Can you? Well, this is what they were doing. They actually tried to do that, literally. They tried to answer this question. Like, some of them were saying, yes, you can. Some others were saying, no, you cannot. There were people who would say just, you know what, this is a mystery, we should not even touch that. And there were also people, including, by the way, Thomas Aquinas, who we'll talk about today, who were saying, no, you can use your reason just to the certain point. God gave you reason for a reason. So naturally, there are at least some questions which you can answer with your reason. And that's what they were trying to do. Okay, so this is like a nice illustration of how the whole thing was taking place. This is one of the first universities in Germany, lecture by Henry of Germany. You see the students there sitting, the lecturer is on this podium, or whatever it is, telling them stuff. They were basically raising variety of questions. So they could raise the question, how do we know God exists, for example? And then the students would give variety of different answers. And then the professor, the person who is in charge of the whole thing, they didn't call him professor, but it's more or less what we call it today, would kind of in the end sum it up and provide his own answer. So this is what the first scholastics were doing in those universities. Again, one of the reasons why they got engaged with all this stuff so much was the return of the works of Aristotle. How did they return? Where were they? Well, like I said, most of them were lost in western part of the Roman Empire for a very simple reason. People no longer spoke Greek, and the works written in Greek were more and more lost. There were only a couple of works of Aristotle which were still in circulation, translated into Latin, categories in De Interpretatione, which is basically his work on logic. So they still had some of his logic, not even all of it. But remember, we were talking about his work on metaphysics. Now that was completely lost. They did not have it. Same with Plato, Republic, which we discovered in this class earlier. They did not have that. At this point, there's two things which made a difference. One of the most important one were crusades. If you know history a little bit, they were going to liberate Jerusalem from the Arabs, from the infidels. And people who were going there were bringing back lots of stuff, including works of Aristotle. They discovered it there. It was translated into Arabic, so at first they wrote it in Arabic. So then it became rather problematic for religious authorities because they realized that, this is very powerful stuff. But in the same time, they did not know how to deal with it. So what they did at first is they simply banned it. It was banned completely. This is where we finally get to the Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas was one of the people who actually read Aristotle as a child and as a student. Well, he was a student very early on. He started at like 14. Back then they were going to university quite early. It was almost like high school. So he read Aristotle. He thought Aristotle actually is fully compatible with Christianity, and he tried to combine that. This is one of the projects he was generally involved in. Aquinas was born in 1225 or 24 in Italy, and like I said, at the age of 14 he entered University of Naples. That was at the time, one of the first universities. It just opened recently before that, and this is where he read Aristotle. Later, he actually comes from a rather wealthy family. His family were counts. They had their own castle. But he decided to join Dominican order. Dominican order were like these traveling poor priests. And of course his family was not very happy about it. The book also gives this story much better than I can do it right now, but nonetheless they tried to hold him back. They did not like this idea, but he felt like this is his calling. Dominicans actually were all over Europe at that time, and after his family gave up trying to convince him that this is not a good idea and allowed him to join Dominicans, they sent him to Paris, to University of Paris, where he got his degree, and he became a very, very important authority who actually helped for the works of Aristotle to be recognized, because church authorities were repeatedly banning them throughout the 13th century. They were trying to stop them, but you can probably imagine what was happening. Students were reading them anyway. It was literally impossible to ban something once it's already there. And so for this reason, they eventually had to accept that. Finally, he died in 1274. There was actually an interesting accident a few months before his death. He said that he had a vision, and because of this vision, he no longer is able to do any work. And then a few months later, he was called to this Council of Lyon. He was traveling there by just walking. Back then, they didn't have much transportation. So from southern Italy, he was walking all the way to south of France, which is very, very far. And at one point, he hit his head on a branch of a tree, and it got infected, and he died. He was taken to the monastery there and died short time after that. Declared saint by the Catholic Church about 50 years later, 1323. He is considered the saint. Catholic Church still thinks that his work is so important that it is kind of official version the Catholic Church endorses as to, the theological explanation. Okay, so what was he doing with Aristotle? Well, he did not accept everything in Aristotle literally, because if you remember Aristotle, not everything there is completely compatible with the Bible. So, for example, Aristotle's God is impersonal. He is not good, and he is not bad. Remember, he is doing thinking, unmoved mover. He is just somewhere out there, just doing his thinking about thinking. So it's more like a rational principle. Nonetheless, Aristotle thought that even though obviously, Aquinas thought that even though Aristotle was not Christian and couldn't have been Christian, or even couldn't believe in God of Jewish religion, nonetheless he thought he was onto something here, because he went through the way of reason to more or less the result we can expect for somebody who is Christian. It's two different roads leading to the same goal. Now, one of the important issues there which we have to mention is the original sin. Do you guys know about the original sin? Did anybody hear about that? What is the original sin? It's like a well-known story, right? Eve taken an apple, given it to Adam, then what happened? Was it all good after that? Well, anyway, so it was not good. God punished them. He kicked them out of the paradise, and another punishment was that Eve, or all women now, have to bear children with all this pain and suffering. But that's not the whole story. He also is supposedly did something to damage human rational capacity. Or at least this is how Augustinian tradition tells the story. Augustine was saying that because of the original sin, all human beings have our reasoning capacity damaged, and we cannot reason our way to God. That was Augustinian version. Now, how can you get out of it? Grace. Certain people get grace from God. those are the people who actually are able to reason their way to God. Because that is like a gift of God. And note that certain people never get that. And some people asking, well, how is it fair? And the answer is, well, suppose like a bunch of people owe you money and you forgive one of them. Would you say it's unfair to the rest of them? No, because they still owe you money. It's up to you who you forgive and who you not forgive. It's not unfair for somebody to forgive one person, release him from his debt, and yet not to forgive the debt of other people. So the explanation is, it's perfectly fair on behalf of God to only give grace to certain people. Now, note that now it actually means that some of us can never be reasonable, can never reason our way to God or to other important things. Not because we don't have enough will for that, but because we are damaged by Adam. And so there was quite a lot of discussion about that. Actually, Thomas Aquinas is one of the first who actually disagrees with that, or at least one of the most well-known people who disagrees with that, and who says, no, the original sin only damaged our moral capacity. For this reason, we all are prone to sin. So stuff like, infidelity and whatever other sins there are, we all commit them. Who here is without the sin? Let's throw the first stone, all that stuff. So basically he's saying in moral subject, yes. But in rational capacity, he disagreed. He said, no, we all have rational capacity. So we can actually use it and get to God through our reason, just as well as through the holy teachings. So this is how he looked at the relations between faith and reason. Suppose that this side is God, this side is the world. So if you want to know things about God, how can you do that? Well, one way is by faith, meaning read the Bible. It all is there. That way does not require you to have any special rational capacity. The other way, you can use your natural reason. And that's a different road. So Aquinas was saying, well, this is kind of like the division. There are certain things, that part, which you can only know from Bible. What would be the example or resurrection of the Christ? The fact that Christ was resurrected from the dead, your reason can never explain it to you. This is something the Bible says, you should take it at faith. So this is here. This is this part. There are certain things which you don't need to read the Bible to know. Some laws of physics. The Bible doesn't even talk about that, right? This is the knowledge about the world. So this would be this part. This is just from natural reason. To find out, for example, that if you drop the apple, it falls down on the ground. Bible is not going to help. There's nothing in Bible which explains the laws of physics. Or at least not much. But there's also this part. Note that it can be approached both from the side of faith and from the side of reason. So he was saying there's certain things which you can actually read in the Bible, but your reason can also help you to know them. Reason in that case is just as good. And any one of us can find out about these things. So therefore there are two kinds of theology based on that. You would say there is revealed or supranational theology. And theology, again, hopefully you read that in the chapter, that's the study of God, right? Theos in Greek means God. Logos means the word or reasoning. So theology is the reasoning, the study of God. There is also natural theology. So revealed theology is you read the Bible, it's only in the Bible, it's based on the authority of those saints who wrote the Bible. Mark, John, and so on. But natural theology is something which not based on revelation, not based on the Bible. It is still leading you to God, but with the way of your reason. So the classic example would be, again, the proof of the existence of God. The book actually talks about that in detail again. Let's go over it one more time. He asks in one of his works, is the existence of God self-evident? Why is he asking that? Well, actually because there was another person before him, St. Anselm, who tried to base the proof of the existence of God on the definition of God. He was saying it is self-evident, meaning any person who has any brain knows that God exists. How? Well, this is how. What is definition of God? What is definition of God? God is the greatest thing, right? It's the greatest thing. It's the best thing. Now, if you look at two possibilities, God exists and God does not exist. Which one is greater? That's the question which Anselm was asking. He was saying, between God which is the greatest and exists, and God which is the greatest but doesn't exist, which one is the greater? And his answer was, of course, this one. Because this one would have a problem, like deficiency. He doesn't exist. So he's not as great as this God. But the definition of God says he is the greatest. So clearly he will be this one. And that's the proof. At least according to St. Anselm. It will be later repeated by Descartes. That's the proof. This is so-called ontological proof. The very definition of God proves to us beyond reasonable doubt that God exists. Now, Aquinas actually disagreed with that. What he said is, well, there's a lot of reasons people may disagree. According to Aquinas, it only does that by to the wise people, people who are knowledgeable. You have to be very wise to understand the existence of God from his definition. Most people are not that wise, and so they would not understand it. And if you don't understand it, it doesn't serve as a proof, because in order for it to be a proof, you have to obviously accept it, right? So that's why he said that's not a very good argument. Even though many people think it's a good argument, and many people also disagree with that. In philosophy, there are still debates, and some people even today think it's a great argument, and other people say no. We will come back to it later. However, Aquinas came up with his own way to prove the existence of God. He thought you can actually demonstrate the existence of God based on features of the world, stuff you see in the world every day. That's how you can prove it. So how can you do that? This is the famous 5 ways. 5 ways is the 5 ways to prove the existence of God. Again, book goes over them in detail. Each one of them, they all have this kind of structure. If the world has feature X, some feature of the world, then there is God. And then it tells you, well, the world does have this feature. Therefore, there is God. Okay, so the first argument for the existence of God starts with motion or change. And the idea is this. The world around us changing, right? We see motion. We see things move. What has started this change? Now, even if you say change is eternal, and you imagine this change happening in kind of a circle, right? Who created 10 commandments? Well, 10 commandments are in the Bible. That's actually something which nobody created. It supposedly were given to Moses, I think, by God himself. So God told Moses, this is the commandments. On the mount, I forgot the name of the mount. And then Moses came to Jewish people and said, I received it from God. So this is how the Bible explains it. Anyway, so back to Aquinas. Suppose it's like a circle, right? The wheel. The wheel is turning. Well, it's very good, but who started the turn? Who gave it the first push? Note that even if you imagine the universe existing forever, it didn't have to change. It could have just existed as this huge painting, right? And painting doesn't move. The fact that it's changing, the fact that it's moving, going round and round, already tells you there gotta be some sort of a mover. Unmoved mover of Aristotle, that's an example. And this is God. The second argument is very close to that, but it slightly gives a different version. And this is basically from efficient causation. Remember efficient causation? Efficient causation is just basically who did the whole change or whole thing. So for example, when we were talking about Aristotle and the house, building the house, who are the builders? How is it different from the previous one? Well, note that, again, even if the world was given the movement, right, by God, which is what the previous argument says, you may still ask, where did the world come itself? Where did it come from? Who built it in order for it to be moved? So the difference between the first and the second, the first tells you we observe change, the world is changing, therefore there must be a source of this change. But the second one tells you, and where did the world come itself? Somebody must have created it. So that's a different way to again say, well, there must have been somebody who created it. And the third one, the first three, by the way, they're all similar in a way, and they're known as cosmological argument. That's the way Kant called it in the 18th century, and we still call it cosmological. This one is based on the ideas of possibility and necessity, or contingency and necessity. So contingency is essentially the same as possibility. Everything we see is possible or contingent. For example, I have a marker, but there could be no marker. Then I will have no marker. I myself, I'm here, I'm teaching you, but it's possible that I would not be here. I would never be born, right? Everything you look at, it could be or not be, including the world itself. It could be or not be. However, there should be at least one thing which is necessary, which is not subject to may be, may not be. Why? Because if there was no such thing, then of course nothing would ever come into existence. Because imagine if there's absolutely nothing. Why would something come out of nothing? So there must have been something which always existed. And according to Aquinas, that has to be God. Why not the world? Well, the world is contingent. The world could be or not be. Only God is necessary. Okay, the fourth argument is kind of like degrees of perfection argument. And again, the book explains it a little bit better, but nonetheless, the idea is we see the world as some sort of a pyramid, right? There are more perfect beings and less perfect beings. We don't think about it that much these days, but this is the way they looked at it back in the ancient times and back in Aquinas' time. So the idea is some things like stones, for example, they are not very perfect, right? They are just laying there. What is more perfect than stones? Animals. If you look at my cat Vasily, he is a lot more perfect than the stone, isn't he? He actually moves around, does stuff, so he would be like maybe here. What is more perfect than Vasily? What is more perfect than animals? Human beings. There are human beings which are also have rational capacity and so on. So note that it's kind of heading up. The argument there must be something on top. There must be something which is perfect to the most degree. Absolutely perfect. And that is God. So this is his fourth argument. And the final fifth argument is argument from design, so-called argument from design. The idea is the world, it's also known as teleological, because remember telos in Greek means the goal, so everything has a goal. We see the world as developing towards something. The world is changing towards something. Now the idea here is, well, can it happen by accident? No, it seems like there should be some sort of designer who made the world in a way that it is doing all these things. So just like anything you encounter, if it has a certain purpose, say you found some sort of a sharp object, you're archaeologist, right? You dug up the grave of some prehistoric person and you found the sharp object there. Now, what would be the question you would ask? What is the purpose of that? What is this for? And that itself will tell you that there must have been a designer of it. Somebody made it for some reason. Similarly with the world. At least that's what Aquinas is saying. The world clearly has some sort of purpose. It clearly is made for some reason. And so there must be a designer. There must be somebody who arranged the whole thing. Okay, so this is the 5 ways. This is how he thinks we can prove the existence of God by reason alone. Note that the idea here is you don't even need to read the Bible. Yes, you can read the Bible, and the Bible will just tell you God exists, and you can take it for granted. You can say, well, it says so in the Bible. But the other rule to the same thing is your reason. Your reason and your observation of the world already also tell you that God exists. So they kind of converge. They both prove the same point. Now the problem again, which many people immediately notice with everything, with all this explanation, is the existence of evil. We mentioned it before. The book again here talks about that. So how do they explain it? There are different explanations for the existence of evil. And it was something which even first Christians were grappling with. And even before the Christians, they were raising this question. But before, not as much. Why did they get so much more concerned with it during the medieval times? Well, because, again, according to the Bible, the God is perfection. It's absolute goodness. The God is the absolutely good. But it also is the most powerful thing. For the Greeks, it wasn't the case. Their gods were not the most powerful. They were kind of struggling and so on. But Christian God, the God of the Bible, the God of the Old Testament, is the most powerful God ever and the most good God ever. So the question again comes back again and again, how is he allowing evil? How did Manichaeans explain it? Remember, for Augustine, they said there's another God, the evil God. But the Christians don't accept that. They don't think there is an evil God. There's just God. And even if there is devil, he is not as powerful as God. So if God allows devil to be in existence, that probably means he's okay with it. So how is he okay with it? How is he okay with evil? If he's most powerful, right? Well, this is the explanation. It's actually based on Augustine's work, and Aquinas kind of endorses it. He says that, well, God has his reason. And the reason is he wants to have people to have freedom of the will and freedom to choose freely between good and evil, because only then goodness makes sense. And it does kind of make sense, because note that if you don't have any choice, if you're forced towards goodness, how is it even goodness then? That kind of raises even this kind of political question when people say, well, look at these fair societies, say socialism or something, where people are directed to do the good things. Now, but the question is it worth it? If you don't have a choice to make a mistake, does your choice really, is it really worthy? Shouldn't you be allowed to make a mistake in order for your true choice of the goodness to be more valuable? What do you guys think? What do we make of it? In what sense? The question is, should we be allowed to make mistakes? Should we be allowed to create evil things? Yes, we should be allowed to make mistakes because we can learn from them. That makes sense because without the bad, there's technically no good. Good would just come from the new normal. Okay, yeah, so you guys agree. Once again, I want to apologize because, I know some students struggling with this being online. I struggle with it too. You can clearly see that the debates are not very lively, and you're probably not enjoying it nearly as much as if we had it in the classroom. This is the unfortunate thing about this damn online thing. In the classroom, students obviously enjoy debating this stuff, and sometimes they got so carried away just talking to each other. Here, you can barely get any answers. But that's the problem with this type of format. Well, sorry about it. I obviously did not invent it. We have to do it because of the pandemic, but hopefully by next semester we'll be back in the classroom. So yeah, there's nothing we can do. Anyway, it's an interesting subject. Just one more thing about Aquinas. The book does not mention that his famous 4 laws. He was saying that there are 4 different types of laws in, you can say, a universe. One law is the eternal law. What is the eternal law? This is the rational order that the ruler of the universe, God, established for his creation, and all things, even inanimate things such as stones, are subject to this eternal law. For example, law of gravity would be a good example. Everything is subject to gravity, there's no exception. This is an eternal law. Now, there's also natural law. What is natural law? That's for humans. Natural law covers our moral behavior. Clearly does not apply to stones, doesn't apply to animals either, but it does apply to human. So that is something which, again, in Aristotle would be temperance, courage, justice, wisdom, all that stuff. That is part of this natural law. And what Aquinas is saying, this is not, as sophists are thinking, depends on the community. This is God-given. And all people have to obey it. There's also divine law. What is a divine law? This is the revelation. This is the Bible. The divine law is something you need for eternal happiness. In other words, if you not only want to be like naturally moral person and not to commit any sin, but if you want to have eternal life, then you have to go above and beyond natural law and also have faith. So, in other words, people who don't believe in Christ would not go to paradise, even if they otherwise are good people, even if they do not commit crimes. They may obey natural law, but they do not obey divine law. And finally, there's a human law. Human law is kind of the lowest type of the law. That's the law instituted by the governments. So, for example, the fact that you should drive on the right side of the road, that is the human law. There's nothing about divine or natural order which tells you to drive on the right side. So how should we approach the human law? According to Aquinas, this is how we should approach it. If it does not contradict any of these 3, then we should obey it. If it does contradict any of these 3, then we should not obey it. So if the government, for example, tells you to do something which is immoral, that is immoral government, and you should not obey this government. So that is actually important because it will have consequences. What are the consequences? Well, for one thing, people will start questioning the government. They will start asking questions like, is this government really doing what it's supposed to do? Because prior to that, in, say, more dark ages, the way people looked at, for example, the king is appointed by God, right? So the king can do whatever he wants. He can murder people by the thousands. He got a license from God. Note how this is different. Here you can actually ask, is this king a moral person? Does he follow natural law? Does he follow divine law? And if he does not do that, you have a right to rebel. You have the right to remove him from power. So that is very important, and this is where a future democratic approach, among other things, will also take hold. Liberal ideology. When we talk about Locke and Locke's idea, Locke believed in God, but he also believed in this kind of approach when the government should be made responsible to people, because not every government is from God. Some governments are from God, other governments not so much. And so that determines whether or not you should obey the government. Okay, so this is most important stuff about Aquinas. Now let's wrap it up. Reading, overview of modern themes. Make sure you read that. Actually, we will change a little bit the order of the lectures compared to the syllabus. I don't know if you look at syllabus very much. It says that on Monday we will have Descartes, and then we will have Locke on Wednesday, but I decided to have one extra lecture on the Renaissance for Monday, especially since there's some interesting stuff to talk about Hobbes. So we'll do that on Monday, so make sure you do the overview of modern themes for Monday. And Descartes, chapter 9, we're actually going to get to Descartes on Wednesday, so that you don't have to do this reading by Monday, but make sure you do the overview of modern themes. We're entering Renaissance, we're entering the birth of human spirit, rebirth of human spirit. Renaissance means rebirth. And make sure you do the homework and quiz for chapter 8. For the Aquinas, the stuff we covered today, due March 7th, both quiz and the homework. Okay, that's all we have for today. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Make sure you are back on Monday, and we will get into Renaissance. Talk about art a little bit. Also an interesting subject. Hopefully you're enjoying it. Okay, thank you, and bye-bye.